Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Color Authority. My name is Judith Van Vliet, and I'm podcasting out of Milan. And today I'm going to be talking to Carmel Levitan from Los Angeles. She is the very first scientist on my podcasts. She's professor of cognitive science at the Occidental College in Los Angeles, California. Carmel received her PhD in Bioengineering from UC San Francisco and UC Berkeley, and was a postdoctoral researcher in experimental psychology at the University of Oxford. Carmel's main area of research expertise is multisensory perception, where she focuses on how the senses interact and how factors such as culture, emotions, and expectations mediate associations within and across the senses. Carmel also welcomes the opportunity to connect with scientists and artists across the world. Let's find out more now with Carmel and learn more about her so interesting work. Good morning, Carmel. How are you today? And welcome to the Color Authority.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today.
Yes, you're calling in from your home, right? Where are you based exactly?
I'm in Los Angeles in California, and surprisingly, it's a kind of foggy day, so it makes it fun to think about being somewhere else.
So Carmel, I ask all of my guests on the Color Authority podcast that very same question. Obviously, I'm going to ask it to you as well. I've had very interesting answers. I'm very curious for yours. What is color to you?
Well, that's a really hard question. I'm going to pretend this is my class for a minute because I teach college students, and I'd say it's a lot of different things. So there's the physical aspect of color. So it's light, it has certain wavelengths in it, and the different mixture of wavelengths is what we perceive as color. But that's kind of the boring part. What's interesting to me is the perceptual properties. So what your eye and your brain do with color, and those are connected to the physical properties, but they're not exactly the same. It's kind of what we make the interpretation of both the physical input that comes into your eye, but also your expectations can change what something looks like, your assumptions about the lighting or the situation. So I think to like that famous optical illusion from a few years ago of the dress, where people could look at the same image and disagree over what color the dress was. To me, that's the fascinating part because it tells me that color isn't really just what's physically in the image. We all had equivalent images. I could show that image in class and we could literally be looking at the exact same image. Right. But instead, it's about the story that our brains tell ourselves about what we think the color means.
Yeah. And that's also what you obviously, because you, I'm just going to tell people, I mean, people just heard the introduction, who you are, what you've done in your life, what you've done in your professional career. But you have had a very different career path than most people that have been on the podcast so far, who are more on, let's say, the designer side, the creative side of color. Can you explain a little bit your passion for the cognitive sciences, where that comes from and how you ended up where you are?
So when I was in college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew that I liked science, but I also liked studying people. And so I worked in a bunch of different research labs. I worked in a space lab where we would study space and astronomy, astrophysics, actually. And I also worked in a psychology lab where we worked with babies. And so I felt a little bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears of like, this research is too slow. This research is too fast. This research is too lonely. This research relies on other people too much. And then I accidentally found a graduate program just when I was surfing the web in bioengineering, which combined some interests I had in both physics and psychology. And so I ended up applying to grad school in that program. And what I really liked is it was really interdisciplinary. So you needed to have a major and you needed to have two minors, and there had to be something kind of related to biology and something kind of related to engineering in there, but it was very, very flexible. And it was actually a joint program between UC San Francisco, which is a top health center. It's got one of the best medical schools, and UC Berkeley, which is a great all-around university and also has really strong engineering. And so it was just really cool to be in this space where people would talk about questions or problems from different angles. And so it wasn't so much I'm getting trained as an artist or I'm getting trained as an engineer, but it was like, let's take a question. And in my case, it was how does the human mind work? And talk about how different kinds of people can have insights into that. And in fact, sometimes I get to even do a little bit of work with artists and study the arts and think about creativity. But for me, it was really all about the interdisciplinarity. And I never really felt like I had a home or knew where I lived until I got the job I have now, which is actually in a cognitive science department. So we intentionally bring together philosophy, computer science, biology, psychology to put in conversation with each other so we can have these conversations like, hey, what is color? And when I just answered that question about color, I talked about the physical and I talked about the mind, but philosophers also have lots of interesting things to say about color as well. And so it's really cool to get all of those things in conversation with each other to think about, well, not only is your brain interpreting something, but could it be possible that your colors could be reversed for my colors? Then I might say, well, biologically, not exactly a perfect reversal, but there is a way where it could be different. And so what I really love about cognitive science is it's baked in from the beginning that we're all talking to each other and thinking about other perspectives to try to learn more.
You started to research the relationship between color and taste and even other senses. How did you come about that very particular research, and why? Where did that interest come from? Because I hear that you're very, very passionate about it, indeed.
So when I was a grad student, I studied how vision, touch, and sound can work together in different ways. And when it was time for grad school, I came over to Oxford, where I worked with a faculty member, Charles Spence, and he was collaborating with Unilever. And they have a really big research arm, and they were asking all of these really interesting questions. I'm trying to think about what I can say without giving stuff away. But their goal was really to make food more enjoyable and to use visual aspects such as color to help people have a better food experience. And so my lab would collaborate on doing some more applied work. And it was really cool to think about, hey, this can actually really have an impact. So some of my research, I can study something in a lab and you can come into my lab and you could try it, but except for maybe clicking on my illusion on the internet, you might never experience it again. But if you can help Unilever make something, say, taste just as good, but be a little bit healthier, that can have major impact on health, on enjoyment, on pleasure for lots of people out there. So that was when I started, was when I was working with Charles Spence on some of these food related projects.
Yeah. And I can imagine also, I worked with Unilever a lot in the past. So I can imagine they also wanted to know how you could possibly combine color with taste. So the product that they're actually selling in the packaging, how those two obviously could relate to give the best experience, the buying experiences of the end consumer, of course, when they are walking through the supermarket aisle.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure now it's even more complicated with so many people shopping online and having shoppers for them and services come to them. And so you might just look at a picture and try to figure out, hey, do I want this type of pasta or that type of pasta? And all you've got is an image. And so that's where things like the color and the packaging can really have an even bigger impact when you can't go beyond just a picture and choosing.
Yeah, in a lot of research that I've done personally, it is indeed that the first information that arrives to your brain is smell. That's the first information that your brain can capture, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And even sometimes in the supermarket, you're not really getting the individual smells, especially of the packaged food. So the color and the packaging is often the strongest cue you really get before making your choice of which one to buy, which one is going to make me feel good, or which one will my kids like.
Yeah, indeed. And that's why color is so important. But in your field, you even go beyond that. It's not just how we design color to make the world maybe a more pleasurable place to be or to buy, but you go even beyond, because you have in your latest research, the latest article that I read about you published called the cross-model correspondence between colors and taste. You talk about the global knowledge of the 4 tastes that are indeed connected to color. Now, I had to look them up. I have to be honest. I'm a color expert. I had to really look them up and I'm sure that there's some people in my audience that are not completely aware of the facts. I can imagine that if you think of yellow, you think of lime or lemons, for example. Could you highlight a little bit what colors are related to, let's say, the main tastes that we have?
Sure. So you were exactly right that if you think of a sour acid, people will often think of something citrusy, so yellow or the right kind of shade of green, like a lemon or lime, although you have a very international audience. So actually, what is the right shade of a lemon to be ripe is not universally agreed upon. Sweet tends to be more associated with the reds or the pinks. You could think of candies that we might give kids or ripe berries.
Yeah.
That perfect strawberry color when you're like, oh, that's ready to eat. That might be a very sweet taste that you would expect. Salty and bitter are less consistent. It seems like it's probably very learned. And if you think about salt as something that you tend to add to other foods, it might make sense that it would kind of take on the properties of what it's with, and it's not really going to dramatically change the color. Sometimes it comes up with bluish, but I'm not sure if that's just because people are contrasting it with the others. And bitter often is connected to brown, and I suspect coffee plays a big role in that because coffee is very widely enjoyed all over the world and does, depending on how you like your coffee, have a bit of bitterness to it.
Are those global? So would you be able to say, and I know you've done a thorough research, maybe not to all populations globally, obviously, but would that still be the same for somebody, let's say, born in Nigeria to somebody who was born in Japan, and then again, somebody, let's say, who was born out in Argentina? Would they still have, I mean, we all have the same four tastes, right? We all have them. But I can imagine that depending where you're living in the world and what your daily food intake is, that it may change also a little bit, doesn't it? Again, perception.
Yeah, I
right?
think experience is going to really overrule. And even if there might be some natural tendency maybe for pink to be a little bit sweeter, if that's not what your local diet is like, it's really going to match. So I would imagine if you were somewhere where you ate quite a lot of mango, which is so delicious and sweet, and at least inside it's usually orange, that might start to become your strongest association with sweetness versus maybe I feed my kids a lot of strawberries. So for them, it might be that pinkish red. So while there's patterns, I think those patterns come more because we tend to eat fruit everywhere. And that might be a major way where we get our information about these, kind of sweeter things. But depending on what you're eating locally, it's going to change. Yeah. I just bought at the market for my kids some Costa Rican pineapple, which is pink. And so we keep talking about, is that pink pineapple actually sweeter than yellow pineapple? Maybe it does. Certainly feels that way, but I don't know if it's just because of the color or if it's actually that variety of pineapple is sweeter. I had never seen it before, though, until this month.
No, I've sometimes I made a big joke about color when I did color theory to some of my younger students that are learning about color, and I placed indeed a picture of a blue hamburger, asked them if they would eat that. And obviously, they all said that they wouldn't. So it is indeed a little bit about, color influences food greatly, and also whether you like to eat something or not. So hence the supermarkets putting blue light on the fish area and a red light on the meat area, right? So that, the colors pop and it does something actually to our brains.
Yes. And, while your students might not have been excited about blue burgers, it seems like every so often some companies do experiment with black food. Mm-hmm. So in Japan, there was a trend for a little bit for black hamburgers. And even in the US where I am, apparently a few years ago, Burger King experimented with Halloween special black buns on their burgers. And a lot of people tried it, but I think it's the kind of thing that you maybe only want to try once for the novelty. And then you're like, actually, that's not.
No, it's not what
I don't really want to eat all out of that food coloring.
No, not every day, indeed. No. So color and taste correspondences go back quite a bit in history, from what I've also learned from your research. And here you mentioned how also certain planets were connected. Now we're going on a whole spiritual area to this talk, sorry, but how planets were connected with certain colors and tastes by Hieronymus Cardanus back in the 16th century. And then there's more recent ones, of course, as well. But where does this human interest come from? Why do you think this interest of us comes from to combine all of these senses, which also is very current if you look at what most design companies are doing today?
Well, I think people have always tried to find order and patterns and structure in the world, in the universe, really, when we're talking about other planets. And we still do so today. I would say Mars is the red planet. And I also associate Mars with maybe the gods and war. And red might be a sort of more violent, harsh planet. So even if you probed today, I think a lot of people might have some more subtle expectations about or associations. I really think, though, it's about structure and people looking for structure across a kind of complicated, confusing world. And so if we can say, hey, this is how I organize the planets, this is how I organize colors, and maybe relate it to tastes as they did back then, sounds, it just makes it feel a little bit more controllable, like we're making progress. It might not be accurate scientifically, but the story of science is having ideas, and some of them are right and some of them are wrong. And when they're wrong, you replace them with newer ideas until you find out your new ones are wrong.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's a mix out of curiosity, of course, to progress, to move forward, to invent the new, but also a little bit, needing to control that, which I guess we haven't really learned then from the last 2 years, right? If we continue to control everything, which clearly we don't have control about.
Even today, there's some interesting research that suggests that even for medicines, the color of the medicine influences how well it works. And it's not because of any ingredients in the coloring, it's because people might think that different colors are going to have different impacts. And so maybe a nice light blue might be a more calming medicine, whereas a brighter color might be a more stimulating medicine. And so even today, we can have real impacts of these associations, even though we know that that color is artificial. And I'm sure that all of these drug manufacturing companies are thinking very carefully about the names, the shapes, colors, so that they can get the desired effects.
No, I'm sure they do. And color is, yes, as we just said, is one of those main ones. And then obviously it is in smell, as we said earlier. How is color indeed related to smell, or is that directly connected to taste? Because obviously the two very often go together when we eat, for example, vanilla pudding or whatever we're eating. And do associations change with time as we get older, for example? Or perhaps when there's a new cuisine that suddenly comes up, like a cuisine that's more innovative, do we see new combinations then being developed as well?
There's a lot in that question. So
I'm sorry.
Let's talk about flavor for a minute. Flavor, the way I think of flavor is it's a multisensory combination of smell and taste. And people seem to start off with some innate preferences to like sweet things, dislike bitter things. So a baby already will favor, say, the taste of milk, and will make a face if you give it some kind of bitter flavoring. Now, so people start off with these innate preferences for taste. These can change with time. So for instance, how much salt people like in their food, people who need to say cut back on salt initially will say that's really difficult, but then as they get used to less salt, then food that they used to like might now taste too salty to them. So we know that these preferences can shift, but you can imagine from an evolutionary standpoint, liking sweet things can be good because we might then eat ripe fruit, eat things that are high in calories, which used to be something that was important for survival and when food wasn't as easily available. And it might be good to be concerned about bitter foods because those might have gone off and not be edible for you to eat. So that might have at least an innate basis. With smell, though, it seems to be largely learned through experience. People have even claimed that babies really don't have, aside from a preference for, say, their parents, they have very few natural preferences. Even you could imagine the smell from the parents is learned. And so it comes over time. So you have a positive association. So it actually, in that vanilla pudding, we tend to think that vanilla smells sweet, but that's because we experience vanilla in sweet things all the time. If you were to eat vanilla itself, it wouldn't actually taste the way vanilla ice cream tastes or vanilla extract seems to taste to us. And so when a smell is unfamiliar, it seems to take on whatever aspects of taste it's paired with. For color, it's probably something similar, more similar to smell. So as you experience color with taste, it's probably a learned association, just like smell seems to be. So the context, the learning. And as you mentioned before, when we do smell something, that usually comes before the taste. The same with seeing something, we don't look at it while we're eating it. Smell is a little bit different because we smell it before and during through different pathways. But both of these, smell and color, don't have quite the same time scale. So that makes it kind of interesting that the smell and the color set the expectations, but you might imagine that color activates lots of possible expectations. So you see something and it's red. I eat a lot of jelly beans, or I used to eat a lot of jelly beans in my studies. And so red could be my favorite flavor, very cherry, but it could also be a cinnamon red hot. And so when I see red, I know it could be either. And then as I start to get that taste of the jelly bean, then I know, oh, that's the spicy one or that's the sugary one. And so you can get a lot of really complex predictions when you start adding in color. So now with age, it does change both through experience, but also the palate can change. So it's related to experience, but also just aging. So kids might have more receptors on their tongue, which means that bitter food might actually physically be transmitted in a different way to their brains than me, who's a bit older. And as people get significantly older, they often experience a loss in sensitivity to taste, which is one of the reasons that color can be really useful to signal what that flavor is supposed to be like and activate memory and emotions and help that food taste the way it used to, or at least more similar to the way it used to. Okay, new cuisine. So there's so many possibilities for what that could mean. Yeah. So my kid's favorite food, my younger one, is rainbow bagels. I look at these rainbow bagels and I think it's just food coloring. But to my 6-year-old, it is imagination, it's fantasy, it's excitement. And that rainbow bagel is so much more enjoyable than a plain kind of beige bagel, even though the flavor is effectively the same. They're using food coloring that's really not adding much flavor. And so I'm sure that her expectations are very different than my expectations. I think artificial, less fresh, processed, and she thinks imagination, princesses,
unicorns,
magic.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Magic. And so one aspect of the new cuisine might be photography, Instagram, YouTube, the way people talk about food. So we're in a very visual culture. I see pictures of galaxy glaze on cake or on donuts, where people use this gel food coloring to make a beautiful picture or basically beautiful image. It looks like a galaxy on that donut, really fancy feats. And yet the gel is designed to be flavorless. So it's really all about the experience. So there, it's an emotional signal. So I think color isn't really telling us anything about the taste. It's telling us care was taken with this. You're going to have an experience. I want you to enjoy this. This is something special. I don't think you're going to eat a galaxy donut every day. That's a once in a while special treat that is extra labor. And so it's really fascinating to me that labor is actually not at all about the taste. It's about how do you feel when you're eating it. And I think that's so important for color, is the emotions, the feeling, the transportation, in the case of a galaxy donut, to a different world or a different universe. Or sometimes it might be actually about transporting to memories or comfort. And so having something be the same color that it would have been 50 years ago with completely different ingredients might also trigger emotions. Yeah. And so people might, I think of things like bananas. So the bananas have changed over time in terms of what breeds of banana. And apparently the dominant form of banana now is different than what the dominant was 50 years ago. So if you buy a banana candy, banana flavoring tastes like the older bananas. And I guess the current banana we have is facing some environmental problems. And so they're trying to figure out what the next banana is going to be. And so as banana changes, we're still going to be looking for, at least in the US, that yellow color to tell us that's a banana. And people seem to not necessarily notice or be very sensitive to these significant, sometimes, changes in taste profile, because the color's right. We're like, that's a banana, and that's overriding what we're actually tasting in our mouth.
So there's two different aspects. There is indeed that memory. So maybe indeed nostalgia for a color, or how we think, how we have associated those. And then there's the whole digital world. And I guess the digital world has completely changed color, taste, and all of those senses that come with it, hasn't it? I mean, it has changed, I guess, than when you started doing these researches to where we are today.
Oh, definitely. Now it's the way restaurants will attract people is through the visual. So I used to pick a restaurant by word of mouth, or I would read the newspaper and I would read reviews by food critics. And now I'm on Instagram and I'm looking at what they've posted, and if something looks beautiful, I really want it. And for me, beautiful might mean these heirloom tomatoes with so many different colors. Just get me, oh, it's tomato season. I'm excited. So for me, it's that purple and green and orange and yellow. And you can get me to come in by just showing me your beautiful tomatoes. For somebody else, it's these galaxy glazes on their food. But we get excited about food now in a very different way. So we're not thinking about it in terms of how beautifully somebody can write a paragraph or article about it. It's really about this connection to the image. And now I want that. I'm hungry. My mouth is watering thinking about some of these. Yeah. And I can get it now, right? So we have all these food delivery apps. And so I could be on my phone and I could say, oh, wow, that looks good. And I can press a button, and 45 minutes later, I could have that donut in my house.
Yeah. And they want that. That's what they expect. The new generations, like they'll see something online. It needs to be available either now or at least latest tomorrow. Otherwise, they lose their customer.
Yeah, it's definitely on-demand food is a thing. Now, related to the nostalgia, I think even for people who are not children, I can think of examples of my own nostalgia for food. So a food when I was a child growing up in the US was Pop-Tarts. These are highly processed. It's kind of like a fruity jam inside a bread-like container. If you offered me a Pop-Tart, I'd say, no way, that's heavily processed. But fancy restaurants will offer their take on Pop-Tarts. And it's actually very exciting to see how they might take a food that I have a nostalgic memory for that I have no desire to repeat and put their own spin on it and have a sort of high-end version. And I think that's where it's fun, where they're connecting to childhood and flavors that I used to have, but not really the flavor I used to have. They're just connecting to the memory and really elevating it to something handcrafted and unique. And each individual one is custom made as opposed to mass produced.
There is so much indeed in the world that just triggers us on a daily basis. And then there is something that I came across in your research as well, is that then certain cultures and certain cuisines, such as Japanese, they have a certain tradition. Let's say I also find that the Japanese food always feels very healthy. They have this tradition to balance 5 colors. How does that then relate to their taste in the cuisine?
I haven't spent enough time in Japan to say I'm truly an expert. And once the pandemic is over, I would love to spend some more time there. But my understanding is that harmony and balance are very important in their food. And included in harmony is not just matching how much sweetness and sourness and umami there is, but also the visual presentation. And they have beliefs that different colors have different impacts. So white is supposed to be about cleanliness. Red is a more stimulating color to make you hungrier. Blue is supposed to be more refreshing feeling that you get out of it. And so it's not necessarily that every single color has to be there via the food itself, but at least via the plating or the arrangement. If you're having a really high-end meal, the chef is going to take time to make sure that you've got this balance across all of these colors, as well as the tastes, textures. They're very thoughtful about how the different aspects of a dish and of the presentation will all complement one another. And that might be part of why we feel good after we eat Japanese food, although they do have their bar food as well.
Yes, indeed. It's deep fried. And especially I did a talk with one of the chocolate and pastry chefs in Europe here with Ramon Morato, and we talked indeed about sweets and flavorings as well. And it's very interesting. One of the things that he said that indeed in Asia, they're still highly on, let's say, not the healthiest artificial coloring and tastemakers in pastry and also in small bonbon chocolates and such. But how do you think, indeed, because we've talked about the flavorings a little bit right now, how do you think that they have changed our perceptions across our lifetime or across the generations? Because obviously that is not a latest invention, but they keep on making new colorings and new flavorings. How do they change our perceptions?
Well, I guess going back to the example of these gel food colorings. Mm-hmm. So now we can get food that looks highly glazed, shiny. I've heard of something called mirror glaze, where it's really reflective. It doesn't always add taste or change the taste, mm-hmm. but it does signal care. Now, it's interesting when you mention food colorings, because I think the US is also behind Europe in terms of rules about artificial additives in their food. And so I would suspect that my food world is actually different from your food world. So if we were to buy candies, like the M&Ms that one would buy in the US are bright and shiny. And I've noticed when I used to live in the UK, some of the colors are a little bit more washed out because they're more natural. And so people do adjust. There is a current controversy in the UK over sprinkles. I guess there was a cake shop that got in trouble for using imported sprinkles with a banned ingredient. And it's gone viral on the internet as the cake shop says that it won't taste the same, whether it's because of the actual taste of the ingredient or really that shiny appearance. So there's the artificial colors, there's the artificial taste. Both of those are going to influence what people think about the food.
Yeah. Although you say it's not necessarily the true taste or the true smell, it really is the visual aspect to it.
Definitely. In some cases, there's literally no taste at all. The gel food colorings are designed to not influence the taste, so you can use them in any kind of food so that you can add in the flavoring that you wanted to have. So it's almost like painting the outside of your food, or, inside throughout the dough, depending on what you're cooking. Yeah. But yeah, these are really more about the feeling. Now, chefs have been doing this all along, right? You can take fruits and you can get extracts. And so the difference between natural and artificial is sometimes a very arbitrary line. Chemicals are everywhere. And so it may be that sometimes that chemical is extracted from a tree. Sometimes that chemical might have been made in a lab. So I'm not sure if natural versus artificial is exactly the right distinction to make when we're thinking about it. You might actually think about whether it's native or not native to that food. And another factor might also be the context. So where are you having it? How often are you having it? So if you take me to a Michelin star restaurant and I know that the colors are intentionally playing with my expectations, that's fun and that's exciting. And I want that. Maybe not every night, but as a special experience, that's something I'm really eager to have. But if I'm going to sort of my local neighborhood restaurant where I might go for dinner every so often, I kind of want it to be the same every time, and I want to get what I expect. So context, again, is really going to shape.
Yeah. You want to have that same experience, which often that's where it goes wrong, right? If you're in the south of France, you're drinking this beautiful rosé wine, you're watching the sunset, and it all seems to fit also with the food. You go back home, you've bought yourself a couple of bottles of that wine, you get home, let's say you're in the winter, you're in your home, you're drinking that rosé, it's completely different. And that's just, I guess, again, it's perception.
Yeah. And part of it might be, when you're on vacation, if I'm in the south of France and maybe I'm smelling the ocean and I'm not thinking about my work, I have all these feelings and emotions that come into it. And at home, maybe I've had a long day and I'm exhausted and I just want to unwind. And I'm coming to that with very different expectations and context. So it might not be the same. So when you open up that bottle, transport yourself, give yourself a moment. Don't just say, oh, I want the same thing, but maybe think back to your trip when you bought it and have that memory. Also think about what you're pairing it with.
Yeah. How do indeed emotions play a role in our sensorial associations? So also color. I mean, how does that really play a role into how we're feeling from moment to moment or day to day? How does that change?
So there's a group I've collaborated with before out of Berkeley that looks a lot at multisensory associations, not so much with taste. They haven't done taste or smell very much, but they did a lot of color, music, and culture work. And so they found that at least for music and color, the way people seem to do the matches was really if a certain song is sad and they associate a certain color with being sad, those are more likely to be matched together. So it seems like it's not so much that, every time you hear a particular band, you see certain colors, but that they evoke similar feelings. Mm-hmm. And since your audience is probably a lot of designers, you might think about packaging, marketing. So when somebody makes an album cover or a book cover, they're going for emotions. So I just saw that a big trend currently, at least in the US, in book covers. So book covers these days, color blobs is a really big thing. So if you were to go into a bookstore, you might see 18 different books that all have these splotches of color and sort of abstract. It doesn't really tell you what the book is about, but it might give you a cue to what type of book it's going to be. Maybe it reminds you of the cover of a different book and you liked that different book. So this is all about a learned association where they're trying to give us some kind of emotional link of if this other book felt this way, this one feels this way. So you might think about that similarly with, say, an album cover, or I don't know how kids buy music these days or stream music, but there's still images, right, that you click on before you decide. And so those are likely, what kind of mood are you in, right? Do I want something to pep me up so I can, say, go on a run or get some things done? Do I want something to calm me at the end of the day? I'm really using the visual cues to tell me what emotion to expect.
When we now talk a little bit about indeed foods, color, especially food in color, sets a clear taste expectation. That's clear from our conversation most of the time. Yet color is more often indeed associated to taste. Now we also talked about sound. Why do you think that color is more connected to taste and not to sound, for example? What would be a plausible explanation for this? That really those two senses are so closely connected.
I think timing might be important. So color, right, that's a cue to help us decide if we even want to try to eat something. So color can tell us how ripe something is. So are those berries ready? Or even might they be poisonous? So it's very rare to have white or yellow berries that are edible. But when they're that nice, intense blueberry color or strawberries, that's when they're ready to go. And so we must be using this a lot of the time, especially you could think of evolutionarily if we were foraging for our own berries. We definitely would need to decide, are they ready? We're not going to have the storage or the mechanism to save those berries. And so here, color is setting the expectation, telling us, is this edible? Is this delicious? We usually get visual and auditory information at about the same time. So instead of it being about expectations, the problem the brain faces is segregation versus integration. So I could be looking at something and hearing something, and they could be coming from entirely different sources. Maybe I hear something behind me. I hear a siren as I'm looking at you on Zoom. And so it's a different kind of question or different puzzle for the brain to solve. Because the first question is, which things even go together? Right. And so a lot of the time they just don't. Whereas if I know that I'm looking at that berry, then I'm using that color as a signal of, is this berry safe for me to eat?
Okay, so it's directly, although you'd think that sound also can indicate something, whether you're in danger or not, such as the ambulance, a fire alarm. But you'd think that that's also a sound that your brain picks up and it goes into, let's say, survival instinct, right? That's what our brain, it sends the message.
Yeah, that's going to be alerting. So if you hear something like glass breaking or an alarm, maybe you're able to stop yourself, but your first instinct is going to be to turn and look and see what's going on. So it's highly alerting, and those two senses are going to be integrated, but it's more like you hear the sound, let me see what's going on, or you see a rustling in the background, let me quickly listen to try to decide if this is a safe sound or a dangerous sound, right? Do I hear a predator or do I hear something else, a cute little rabbit? So sure, all of these are going to go together all of the time, and it's really important that they do. But for food, typically, at least, we're looking at it before we're eating it to decide if we want it. So that's a little bit different than what was over there.
Do you help a lot of, indeed, let's say these companies? I mean, we discussed one company, but I imagine there's many more, and where you maybe work with designers or marketing teams to indeed do similar projects that you've done with Unilever, for example.
So since your audience is more design oriented, who I really like to collaborate with, honestly, now is more the artists. Mm-hmm. So collaborating with companies can be interesting, but it can also go down a path that's maybe not what you intended. So let's imagine, hypothetically, I helped a company make their ice cream have a little bit less sugar. So I mentioned that that's exciting because it's high impact. Right? It helps a lot of people be healthier. But at the end of the day, it turns out I'm personally not that interested in selling more ice cream. What I really love is helping to create an experience. Mm-hmm. And so with COVID, I have not been able to do this for a while, but where I'm really excited about collaborations is, can we create new innovative experiences that aren't so much about selling more of something, but giving people a new feeling. So we have an Institute for Olfaction in Los Angeles that one of my colleagues, my closest lab research collaborators, reached out to and started working with a little bit before the pandemic. That works a little bit on hold still, because the last thing we're going to do is take a bunch of students into a space
to
maybe smell not perfumes, now. Right. No. But she brought her class to this space, and they each created their own perfume scent. And so there's lots of cool opportunities to think about how the senses work together in the context of art. Now, this is not to say that it's not worth working with companies. I think there's really cool opportunities to do things. But for me personally, what I really love is when I can work with an artist and really we can mutually learn from each other. So there is an artist at my college right now who I've been talking with about how could we create spaces that might feel restorative. And so we're both moms. We both have young kids. And the pandemic has been very challenging for us. It's been challenging for everybody. It's challenging for different people in different ways, but still having kids at home a lot of the time, or just dealing with uncertainty with respect to children and not having enough hours of the day. My kids don't have childcare yet. Her kids have childcare, but as soon as somebody gets sick, everybody gets
home
at
again.
Home and quarantined.
Yeah.
So we're still in a state of flux. So we've talked about, could we create some kind of 5-minute or 10-minute just experience where people could, and we're still not sure if it's going to be physically in a space or if it really ends up being an app or some kind of thing on your computer, but where the combination of kind of color, line, fluidity, how things change over time might change the way you feel. So you could imagine kind of jagged edges moving quickly. That's not a very relaxing experience, as opposed to sort of slow wave-like motions, colors more like in the blue and the green space, and maybe music that's slowly changing. So kind of repetitive with the theme. So we're talking about, maybe can we create experiences that would be free because we're not interested in marketing it, but that could just help people. So really, can we make people's lives just a little bit better in little 5-minute bursts?
I think that's amazing, by the way, but I also think that is where this world needs to go. I mean, it's one of the things that I personally also am interested in. Also, how can color help people, truly help people, not by selling more stuff? That's good and that's great, but also how can it truly help people in their feelings, in trauma, for example, in healing, in communities. And I believe that already color can do a lot just on a daily basis. It is even what you wear, it's what you surround yourself with. I can imagine with you connecting that also to other senses, such as sound, for example, and possibly indeed smell, if you can do something that indeed is physical or in a space. I think that is a beautiful direction to a world that needs to be connected again to the senses a little bit more, because we've been a little bit disconnected, right, over the past couple of years.
Well, we'll see what the next few years bring. It's a little ambitious.
But it's interesting then, the whole concept of that I've been researching a little bit is synesthesia, which I know there's a lot of people that, not a lot of people that have it, but let's say there's world famous painters such as Kandinsky that obviously experienced the color taste synesthesia at one point. And he wrote about a Dresden doctor in Germany who tells how one of his patients, who he describes as spiritually, unusually highly developed, invariably found that the certain sauce had a blue taste. It affected him like the color blue. What do they experience exactly? I mean, I'm reading this and I know what I can read, obviously, but I don't know what it means. And how is this, let's say, neurological condition, how is it explained, if you can explain it?
So synesthesia is really diverse and lots of people are studying it right now. And it's described in a lot of different ways. So in the case of this doctor's patient, that might be a pretty positive experience. So here it sounds like, taste-induced colors. So this sauce might be blue. And so you could kind of imagine, like if you have in your mind's eye, when I say imagine a red apple, you might see a red apple. It might be that when this person has this particular sauce, they get that same sort of blueness or redness that you might get in your mind's eye when you imagine something. Mm-hmm. Now, there's also the opposite type of synesthesia, which I've heard is a lot less pleasant, colors-inducing taste. Mm-hmm. So I've heard that this can actually be very unpleasant, because here you could imagine, red gives you a sweetness, blue gives you a sourness. So at least one person has written about this experience. It's pretty terrible because they never knew when they were truly hungry. And so their drives to eat were very disrupted because they were constantly getting these tastes in their mouth. And they said literally like their mouth would water and their stomach would prepare to digest food. So I think you can get the full spectrum of, most people with synesthesia say this is a positive thing that enhances my life. So what's going on in the brain? That's a hard question. Mm-hmm. So we do know that it tends to run in families. And so there's different categories of theories. One is that the people with synesthesia have extra connections between sensory areas. So people have suggested that babies are born with the sensory information highly overlapping. So that for babies, it's all a whirlwind and that the senses aren't truly separated yet. Light, sound, color, it's all mixed up, and that we learn to differentiate them. And so it might be that the people with synesthesia have kept more of these connections, or that these connections are stronger for some reason. So there was one study I read that claimed that people with synesthesia might have more myelin on neurons that connect different brain areas. So myelin is like a kind of coat on the neurons that helps the signal transmit. And so having more of it might make that signal stronger. So maybe these people have just a slight extra.
Yeah, they get more signals. They get more information coming in.
More information traveling around. Now, just to make an extra wrinkle, there is some research suggesting that in some cases it's possible to actually induce synesthesia. So that hypnosis could create synesthetic-like experiences. And we know that use of drugs can create synesthetic-like experiences. But it's hard to say, are these really the same sort of thing, or are these something different? So what's special about people who truly have synesthesia is that they're highly consistent. You can bring them in and ask them about their associations. And researchers have then brought them back several years later for a surprise test, and they're highly, highly consistent over time. So it doesn't seem to be quite the same as, say, a drug-related experience where people might experience a merging of the senses. But what is interesting about those induced cases is that maybe it means we all do have the right pathways in our brain, but that we're inhibiting them. Now, those of us without synesthesia might be inhibiting that information. So sort of blocking it or saying that's not a relevant signal, that's noise, don't use that, whereas maybe people with synesthesia aren't. And sometimes it's useful. So artists have said, this actually can help me. Or even there's people who have a type of synesthesia of color letter synesthesia or color number synesthesia. So the shape of that number, like a 3 might be blue and a 6 might be red. And it can actually help them solve math problems. They can be faster at doing their times tables and their arithmetic as children because they have this extra information of the colors, and they might actually recognize those numbers faster because they have a color towards them. So it does seem like, and that's also more evidence that it's really a real experience and genuine, because it is actually seeming to make people just a tiny bit quicker.
Yeah. A lot of people in my industry find it very special, obviously, because of the color part, but also connecting it to multiple senses. And I think there is a lot of people tapping into this industry right now. I think a lot of people have read about Pantone with indeed the classic blue, the color of the year that they did 1 or 2 years ago. Indeed, they tapped in this synesthetic field because they combined color and fragrance, sound and taste. Was that really also an example that you really thought was also provoking? Or did you read about that example? What were your thoughts on that, on a color company, bringing people into that world of multiple senses?
Oh, I love it. I think it's great. It's creative. It's fun. It's exciting. And it really helps link that specific shade, right? It's not just about blue. So we've been talking about taste like, oh, red is sweet, yellow is sour, but it's really a lot more specific than that. Like I have specific associations because of how I've grown up in my context of, a certain shade of pink is like this bubblegum pink, and that's pop music, and it's childhood, and it's fun, and it's Barbie. So I think what they're doing with theirs is really creating that full experience. So it's not just, hey, this is the shade of the year, but here's everything that we're going to help you associate with it. And something interesting I saw during the pandemic is that some of the really high-end restaurants were starting to send home experiences. So they started thinking a lot, not just about the food, but what food to even serve, first of all. So what kind of food can you get as a takeaway that's going to still taste good when you heat it up in your house? But then some of them got really interested in packaging and what came with it. So there's a place in Los Angeles, Vespertine, that is, if you were to go in person, it's very innovative. You're eating food where you're not quite sure what it is. You move from room to room throughout the meal. They play music that is very divisive, actually. Some people find it oppressive and other people love it. And at the end of the night, they would give you, the last part of the night, at least before the pandemic, was a room where they had different areas where they had different smells that you had had throughout the meal. And then they give you a fragrance that is the synthesis of that meal. And the idea is you can open up that little vial and you can smell what your meal was. So this restaurant now in the pandemic is faced with a very different situation. So they started sending home stuff. So some of their meals would come with incense. One of them came with like a crystal, and you could feel the crystal. They had food that came with like the rocks that might have been in, say, the oven to cook with it. Sometimes the packaging was white, sometimes black, but like a whole unboxing. So if you think of all those unboxing videos, for some reason go viral, of people opening the new iPhone or children opening up these kind of like a Kinder Surprise egg. And it is fun to open something up and get a treat. So they have thought about what's the whole experience. So how can I make opening up this meal feel special and feel like a treat and indulgence and not just your normal takeout or takeaway? And so for me, it's been really interesting to see how during the pandemic, restaurants have gotten extremely creative building this experience. And I've even heard of some saying this is our recommended playlist. You might want to listen to this during your meal. And so going back to your example of that wine doesn't taste the same when you eat it at home after a long day than when you had it on vacation.
Yeah.
Maybe one way to bring that back is to think about what sounds go with it. What are you smelling? Even what are you wearing? I heard during the pandemic, some people were getting dressed up, putting on their fancy clothes and having a Zoom with their friends, but you feel like you're at a party if you're wearing a fancy outfit.
I love the example of that LA restaurant that you just talked about. I think people have gotten more creative in the COVID pandemic. You can see that. I just went to my first exhibition again, Milan Design Week, and there was so much creativity and so much more color. And indeed, slowly, younger students and designers are using the color with the fragrance. So mainly smell, not yet taste, but they're linking the two of them. What was the most fascinating or maybe most surprising color food association that you researched or that you read about? Something that you had not expected?
I still am blown away that vanilla is not sweet. This confuses me every time. Like, of course, vanilla is sweet. I love vanilla ice cream, vanilla cakes, but it's not. That's completely learned. And similarly, just looking at different countries and what their associations are. So I would never think that I could eat a yellow lime, but it turns out that ripe lemons can be green and yellow limes can also be ripe. And so my expectations, the extent to which they're completely colored by what people think is attractive in the supermarkets that I go to, it's just stunning to me all the time. And so there's foods that I would have never tried, and yet they might be perfectly good. So in the US, we have a big problem with food waste of people just won't eat things.
Yeah,
when
here too.
Actually, yeah. So that's something that to me is surprising, maybe not in a good way. The other thing that fascinates me is that Black food keeps coming back as a trend. So ice cream with activated charcoal in it, it doesn't really taste good. But the novelty and the Instagrammability to me is a really fascinating aspect of people will actually eat food that tastes worse so that they can make a TikTok about it.
Yeah, I haven't tried it yet, but yeah, obviously, I mean, I live in the country of ice cream. Italy, of course, but I once came by, I didn't taste it, and now I'm sorry that I didn't. It was garlic ice cream. I'm not kidding. I had basil with mango, which was amazingly tasteful, but garlic ice cream, I'm still, I need to get back to that shop. It was somewhere in Rome, I think, which I never would have expected that. Never.
Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that either, but it might be good. So I think of chocolate and wasabi, and I would not have said that's a combination that I would have come up with, but it's actually pretty good if there's just a little bit.
Do you do this a lot when you're just walking around or when you're visiting places? Like me as a color designer, it's hard for me to just walk in a room and not be influenced by my work or looking at the color or, commenting even on it. Some friends of mine have just said, oh, there we go again. So I stopped doing that. Do you have that as well in your daily life, that you just immediately are influenced by all those associations that you see around you?
I do, and I try to remind myself not to overanalyze. So if I'm getting a fancy meal, it's almost like a two-step process. First, let's try to enjoy it as a holistic experience, but then I'm totally going to go back over it and analyze every part of it and think, all right, the chef did that on purpose. Like this restaurant I mentioned, Vespertine, there's always black tissue paper now in their takeout. And I know that that's a deliberate choice. I don't even think it's easy to get all of this black paper. And so first I'm like, okay, I'm just going to have the story. I'm going to feel it. I'm going to let the chef tell their story without me trying to diagnose it. But then it's so enjoyable for me to go back over every little piece. And the same with an art exhibit. So if I'm in an exhibit where they're playing, say, with color and sound, or even just color and they're moving it around and trying to create an emotion, I really do my best to first have the emotion and only after that, and then think about, okay, why did that? Why did the dots moving in that way affect me the way it did? But it can be hard to separate out this more analytical way of enjoying the experience from the holistic human part.
One last question to you, Carmel. What is a next study that you're working on, if you may reveal, of course?
So I always have a ton of studies going on, but one I'm really excited about coming back to is one I started before the pandemic, where we had people doing associations between colors and shapes. But instead of doing the classic thing of what color do you think the shape is, we actually just asked them to color. We gave a bunch of shapes and we gave them a mood questionnaire, and we told them we really wanted to see how coloring impacts their mood. And then we wanted to just see how they colored for more jagged shapes, more soft and rounded shapes, played with so many parameters of how many bumps, how big the bumps, is it concave or convex? And so I'm excited to get a little bit more into that and to try to see, is it systematic? And the big surprise of that study, which shouldn't have been a surprise. So a lot of people just colored the whole shape, but people were very creative in what they drew. So they would turn something into a shark or an award or a prize. And so seeing what their associations were in a more organic way, instead of this lab context of you have 5 options, select the color that matches. It was really cool to give them a beautiful set of colored pencils. It was one of the most fun experiments because we got to drive to the art store, what's the best array? And we tried all of the different pencils for the feel, because we said, if people are going to be coloring for 10 minutes, we want it to just be fun, relaxing, creative.
Yeah, no stress.
So we really want to, no stress. So we really wanted to see if there's consistency. So that did not translate well to Zoom or online
obviously
research. And so we want to pick that study back up again and look some more about what kinds of color shape associations people have in this more organic, creative, free association style.
What generation is that you are working with? Just out of curiosity, how old are they?
So most of my participants are college students, and my college is mostly, 18 to 22, 23-year-olds. So yeah, it would be nice to compare with an older group as well, one thing at a time.
No, I get it. But it's interesting indeed, because as I said, we all know that color and shape is related, but how that relates then to emotions and feelings, I think that is indeed a next step. Very, very interesting. I'm curious. I'm going to keep following you, and I'm going to keep sometimes emailing you or just calling you to know where you're at and just to see, your research. I think it's super, super interesting what you're doing, and super thank you for being available and to be on the Color Authority podcast.
Thank you for having me. I hope to invite you to visit the lab one day, or any of your listeners can write me anytime if they want to come to sunny Los Angeles and color. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So this was Judith Van Vliet from the Color Authority. Thank you for listening again to yet another episode. If you haven't done so, please go to Apple Podcasts, subscribe, review, and send us feedback on this episode. And I hope that you will be listening to the next episode coming out very, very soon. Thank you, and have an amazing, colorful day.